Volume swells can add such a great ambience, feel, and sound to any style of playing or music. I first remember hearing this sound or technique when I was listening to one of Jeff Beck's songs live at Ronnie Scott's, as well as Cathedral by Van Halen. It sounded very ethereal and exotic, especially when all I was used to playing and listening to is just that pentatonic scale rock and blues licks. Using this volume swell technique can be very beneficial and can add a lot to your playing. So in this video, I thought to give you some tips and show you some ways that you can utilize this built-in effect on your guitar. It's one of the very few effects that won't cost you anything except for maybe some time to get this technique down right. And when you do get it down, you'll be using it whenever you get the chance. There's 3 different techniques that I'll be showing you, and you can see which one works best for your style of playing. But before we get into that, thanks for joining me in this week's video. If you want to see more lessons like this, then consider hitting that subscribe button down below. Now, a quick little disclaimer here. Some guitars are actually a little harder to do this with. Strat style guitars are obviously the easiest because the volume knob is much closer to the strings, but Les Pauls, on the other hand, are a bit more difficult since the volume knob is just so far away from the strings. Now, only one out of the 3 techniques I'll be showing you will be pretty hard to do if you have a Les Paul or a guitar with a super far volume knob. But the other 2 techniques you'll have no problem whatsoever, no matter how far the volume knob is at. And with that being said, let's jump right into the first volume swell technique. So this one's the easiest to do, and I like to call it the Cord Swell. Pretty much all we're doing is just strumming any chord, having the volume knob at 0, and once we strum the chord, we slowly bring that volume knob up. Now, if you noticed, I'm not using a pick, and throughout this video, I'm going to be using my thumb to strum and pluck notes because it's much easier to do this technique with an open hand. So a few practice exercises you can do to start with this first technique is just start with one chord, strum it with the volume knob at 0. Once you strum it, just bring up the volume knob. And then bring it right back down. Now, this will only take you a couple of times to get it down. It's really not that hard to do, but you're eventually going to want to switch chords. So start off with just practicing chords that are closer together. For example, now an important thing is when you strum that first chord and you bring that volume knob up, it's important to bring it down before you switch to the next chord. That way you can give that next chord its full volume swell. So here's another example. Now, if you've never done this technique before, this is the one to get started with. Like I said, just play some simple chords, G, D, and C, whatever you want to do, and go back and forth with the volume knob. You kind of want to see where your weak areas are at and where you can improve them, whether that be you're having a hard time doing both at the same time. And if that's the case, just stick with one chord for now. Also, as you can hear, I'm using a shit ton of effects such as reverb and delay. It doesn't necessarily need these wet, crazy effects. It just sounds so much better. I'm going to be keeping these effects on throughout the rest of the video just because it sounds really cool and I enjoy using it. So now that we got the first easy volume swell technique down, let's move on to the next one. Now, this one can be either a little bit more tricky or easier than the first one, depending on what you're good with. For example, the first one, we're strumming and volume swelling at the same time. For this technique, our hand is just going to stay on that volume knob and we're only going to be using our left hand. So we're taking a step out by not strumming, but you may struggle a little bit more with your left hand. So for this one, I like to call it the Hammer On Swell. So as you saw, our fretting hand is just hammering onto the frets, and our strumming hand is just constantly going back and forth with the volume knob. When we're hammering onto single notes, we may find that we go a little quicker compared to when we're just strumming chords, which means that your strumming hand's gonna have to go a little faster with the volume knob. And doing this can really tire out your hand. So we can now try a different volume swell approach that might work better for you. So instead of using our thumb, pointer, middle, and ring finger to sort of turn the knob, we can just now use the side of our pinky and a little bit of our hand. Now, the only problem with this approach is that sometimes it can be hard to volume swell up to the full 10 and go back and forth. Normally when I do it, I land around the 8 or 9, so I don't get that full swell. But the more you work on it, the more comfortable you will be, and you will be able to feel when you get up to that 10 and when you get back down to 0. Now, me personally, I don't really like using this approach. I prefer just to swell with my fingers, even though it does really tire the shit out of them, but most of the time, I'm really not using this technique or volume swell technique for the hammer-ons very long. It's normally just for a couple of seconds during a solo or lead or whatever it may be. Now, going back to our fretting hand, I think it's best to really apply a good amount of pressure when you're hammering onto these frets. Because sometimes if you do it very light, it can be very hard to hear and the pickups don't pick it up very well and you're not going to get that much sound when you swell up. So for example, if I played it very light, obviously, it's still a little bit noticeable, but in the mix, it may be very low, or if you're playing live, no one's really going to hear you. But if we dig in a little more and apply more pressure onto the frets, we get this. Sometimes it's not actually very ideal to hammer on super hard because it kind of messes up your approach and when you're playing. And it's actually a little easier to miss the fret you're going for if you're kind of just wailing on the frets. So another thing you can possibly do is not so much on the guitar or your hands, it's on your pedal board or your amp setup. You can turn up the gain on a pedal or on your amp, use compression. Now that definitely helps because it just sustains the note a little bit longer. And like I said earlier, you can also use reverb and delay. If you try this approach with no effects whatsoever, just through a completely clean amp, you will notice that you may have to apply more pressure when you're hammering onto the frets. So now that we have a better understanding of this hammer-on swelling technique, the swelling of the volume knob, as well as those chords, let's now move on to the third and final volume swell technique, which is one of my all-time favorites to use. Now this one is the best sounding, but it's definitely the hardest out of the three to do. I'm sure this technique is called something else, I just can't think of it right now, but I'm gonna call it the volume plucking swell technique. So this is the technique I was talking about where you need a guitar like a Strat where the volume knob is super close to the strings. Because what I'm doing for this one is both plucking and volume swelling at the same exact time. Now, like I said, this one can be a little challenging for you, so here are a few ways you can practice this. So since we're using our thumb to pluck these notes, we're going to have to use our pinky to swell at the same time. Now, this sort of goes back to the second technique when I was talking about that hammer-on, that we can use the side of our pinky instead of just doing it like this because our hand will get tired. So for this case, we're gonna have to use the pinky swell technique. So to start practicing this, let's start on just the B and high E string since it's a little closer to the volume knob. Start by plucking one note. So go to the 7th fret on the B string, pluck it with your thumb, and once you pluck it, slowly bring up that volume knob. Now when you're swelling with the volume knob, I either do two different things and it depends on the context. It's kind of random what I do. Sometimes I just use just my pinky, but other times, if you notice, I actually put my thumb down on the volume knob to help the swell. I think I more so do that when I'm really trying to get a note to ring out, because sometimes, like I said, when you use your pinky, it's hard to get to the full 10, so I use my thumb to help me get there. So start with just a single note, swell up, bring it back down, then maybe pluck another note. Swell up, bring it back down, another note, bring it back down. If you want to practice these exact notes, you're more than welcome to. I'm just using the last bit of the B minor pentatonic scale. So I'm just using the 7th fret on the B string, the 10th fret of the B string, my pointer on the 7th fret of the high E string, and then my ring finger on the 10th fret of the high E string. And you can go back and forth between all those notes. As you're practicing the single note pluck and the swell, remember you can also incorporate those other two techniques that we talked about previously. You could add some chords and triad shapes throughout your little lead stuff. And you can also throw in that hammer on too. As you start to get more comfortable with using those higher strings like the B, the G, B, and high E string, you can then maybe start to bring your thumb up and pluck the notes on the lower strings, the E, A, and D string. And you can practice this simply by just playing a scale. So maybe we can do the major scale now, maybe in C major. And another great thing you can do is instead of playing just that scale shape, you can play it on one string. So for example, if I were to play it in C major again, I would play this. I actually think it sounds a little bit better that way when you do it on just one string, so maybe practice that way if that's what you like to do. Now, these three techniques can be used in a lot of different scenarios, whether that be adding ambience to your song or just using it in your solos. Me personally, I like to use that third technique the most, especially if the song is very ambient and laid back. So what do you think about the volume swell technique? And out of the three, which one is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments. Make sure to follow me on my socials. I'll link them in the description where you can see other additional content that you may not see on my channel. Thanks for watching this week's video. I will see you in the next one, and don't forget to keep on playing.